We have seen that Ivan Ilyich, his friends, and his wife share a common understanding of life. A life should consist of distractions from primordial issues and should lead to pleasant, proper living. The pleasant proprieties are themselves the distraction from the inner struggles of man over his miseries, crashed dreams, untold happiness, his worries about his own small size in the face of eternity. One might have thought that these sources of struggle would be central to understanding what life is about, but they are so difficult to answer that it is best to put them out of sight. That is the way the society Tolstoy observes. The question that is most obscured in that society is this: what is the right way of life? How shall I live? Society had provided ready-made answers to these questions, and Ivan had followed them. As the book continues with his illness, he comes to understand his mortality and to ask himself, finally, how should I have lived? Regrets. That is what Ivan comes to have. These regrets make him more human in Tocqueville's terms, in part because the end of the line is in sight. The illness proceeds. In chapter 4, Ivan is irritable and consults a doctor in the hopes that there is a proper scientific reason for the pain in his side. The doctors, first a general practitioner of sorts, then later specialists, treat his illness as a technical issue. Is it this or is it that? None of them address head-on or even obliquely the real issue for Ivan. Is this serious? Ivan, like a good proper person, follows the doctor's directions on how to get better. And his life now becomes obsessed with health instead of work or whist. His wife is hardly a source of comfort. She blames his whole illness on his inability to follow the doctor's direction, even though the various doctors give contradictory directions. Ivan tried his old strategies for dealing with his failed marriage, for dealing with his illness. He tried to pretend it was getting better, or that it was nothing at all. He tries to lose himself in work. He turns to his colleagues, but they annoy him with his unconcern. He tries to play whist, but he does uncharacteristically badly, and then worries about why he doesn't care that he does badly. What frightens him the most is that, quote, he had to go on living like this on the brink of disaster without a single person to understand and pity him, end quote. A visit from his brother-in-law, shortly before New Year, I think, convinces him that he is a dead man. He begins to think more deeply about his life. He begins to reflect, quote, I'll be gone. What will there be then? Nothing. So where will I be when I'm gone? Can this really be death? No, I don't want this. Death. Yes, death. And they don't know. And they don't want to know and have no pity for me. They're playing. End quote. He says these words as his wife entertains friends, while Ivan is shunted off in the side room. Still, Ivan thinks a bit about himself and his destiny, and also a bit about how others are thinking and what they do not see. He continues, fools. I'll go first, then they, but it will be just the same for them. End quote. He sees their blind spot because it had been his blind spot. Still, Ivan has no resources, no tradition, no revelations, no books, no perspective to help him deal with his impending demise. What was his alternative? Even that question does not yet enter his mind. He cannot grasp the thought of his death. He is, quote, completely unaccustomed to such an idea, end quote. His modern society was just, as Ivan realizes in chapter 6, a series of screens designed to obscure the thought of death. Those around him lie. They say he is just sick, though they all know he is dying. This is a lie, he says, that degrades, quote, the awesome, solemn act of his dying to the level of their social calls, their draperies, and the sturgeon they ate for dinner. And this lie was an excruciating torture for Ivan Ilyich. He continues thinking as follows, quote, he saw that the awesome, terrifying act of his dying had been degraded to those about him to the level of chance unpleasantness, a bit of unseemly behavior. They reacted to him as they would to a man who emitted a foul odor on entering a drawing room, that it had been degraded by the very propriety to which he had devoted his entire life. There are some sources of comfort in Ivan's dying days, and the next video will survey some of those. However, the most crucial aspect of his last days is his confrontation with the reality of his life and death. He wants to know what his suffering, his loneliness, means. He calls out to God. Is God cruel? Is he absent? He then begins a crucial inner dialogue with his soul. This is, I presume, the part of him that considered it immoral as a young man to act extremely vile, and that made him disgusted with himself for a while. We have seen this from page 44 in chapter 2. This is the part of his soul, let's call it his conscience or his internal spectator, that begins to raise questions about the rules of propriety. This is the key point in the novel. Ivan tells his inner voice that he wants to live, but his inner voice responds with a question, quote, to live? How? End quote. Ivan responds that he would live as he had before. As you lived before, happily and pleasantly? Asked the voice in response. This begins the crucial education of Ivan. He thinks about when he was happy and living pleasantly. He had pleasant memories of childhood before he was as educated in society's ways. As he moved closer to adulthood, all the seeming joys of his life vanished before his sight and turned into something trivial and often nasty. Ivan says to himself, quote, it's as though I had been going steadily downhill while I imagined I was going up. That's exactly what happened. In public opinion, I was moving uphill, but to the same extent, life was slipping away from me, and now it's gone, and all I can do is die. Then we get the genuine tragedy of Ivan Ilyich. 2 thoughts. He says to his inner voice, quote, perhaps I did not live as I should have, but how could that be when I did everything one is supposed to? The same thought appears at the end of chapter 10, for those keeping track at home. Ivan did everything right. Put yourself in Ivan's shoes. He went to school, got good grades, pursued a career, had a respectable marriage, and raised his children to respectability. He served the public dutifully as a bureaucrat and administrator of justice, hardly a dubious calling. He read popular novels. He probably would accumulate and play video games, watch the NFL, and wear the garb of his favorite sports team were he alive today. He did it all right. It is a, quote, bizarre idea, end quote, he closes chapter 9 with, that he hadn't lived as he ought to. Ivan is having the philosophic insight here. He is questioning the ways of his society. He is wondering whether the poets of his society or his cave are teaching the truth about human beings. We are now in chapter 10, proceeding on to chapter 11. Ivan works out the tension in his position in the rest of the novel. He did everything right, but he still wasn't happy. Was there something wrong with his society's understanding of right? Or was there something wrong with his feeling of regret for how he had lived? We will turn to how he works out the logic of this in the next and last video.